Morning, guys. So, turn this thing up real quick. So, today's a new day. Today's an interesting day. We're gonna do something kind of cool. It's finally gonna happen. We're gonna see about putting together that 2.8 liter V6 for the white Fiero. I'm on my way to the parts store right now. Pick up just a couple things. We're gonna get out the driveway. I need to pick up silicone because even though the oil pan gasket we're going with is a pretty good one, I still kind of prefer to actually have silicone on them, just from experience. I also need a little bit of brake clean to clean some stuff up, but I've mostly been cleaning with gasoline. It's the cheapest cleaner you can find. But a little brake clean will help for getting into some passages, and then we can get back here and we're gonna actually start assembling it. So, quick rehash on what this build's gonna be. It's gonna be a standard 2.8 liter V6. It's a untouched block. It's never been bored or anything. I ran a hone through it, and I'll show you that here in a little while. But I ran a hone through it just to clean the bores up. Get past the gears. Clean the bores up. Clean the whole block up. Me and Amy painted it probably a couple years ago. So of all the stuff I've ever built, it'll have had the most cure time of anything ever for engine block paint. But in any case, so it's painted up and everything. I cleaned up all the pistons. We're going back standard bore, so I just ordered some standard rings, and it's going to have a used comp cam in it from one of my old builds. And I'm not completely happy about that, and I'll show you why here in a little while. But honestly, right now, and it's the reason this video is coming out a little late, budget. Money's tight right now. It's the first part of the year. So it's going to go back together with what we got, and we're going to see how it goes. If something goes wrong, or it needs to, either the bores aren't right, or that cam has a problem, we'll tear it out and we'll rebuild it. It's just not the first time I've done it. So, but in any case, so that's what I'm on my way to do right now, is go get some parts so we can start assembling it. But I'm excited. It should be a lot of fun. Once we put a V6 in that white car, it will effectively be a 1988 Formula clone, which is kind of cool, because if you know anything about Fieros, formulas are kind of desirable, kind of hard to come by. So I'm excited. So let me go over here and get these parts. We'll get back to the house. I'll show you what we got and what we're doing, and we'll start working on assembly. Okay guys, so I've got everything laid out here, and it's time to start getting to putting things together. So I've just basically laid out all the parts that are going to go into this build and all the little bits and pieces. Now, since this is a budget build and it's being put together with stuff that's just kind of laying around, there's going to be some used parts here. There's actually going to be quite a few used parts. Let's start over here on the bench and take a look at what we got. So these are going to be rod bearings for the piston rods. We've got main bearings here. We've got new sets of lifters. Well, I'll show you what these go to. These go on top of this camshaft later. We got new head bolts for it. Brand new Cloy's timing set. Used comp cam. I'll show you in a minute some of my concerns with that, but we're going to do our best. New piston rings. We're going back standard bore. These are the original pistons that came out of this block, and they're basically just cleaned up. I dunked these in some gasoline for about a day or so, scrubbed them down, and they seem to be doing pretty well. They're all nice and loosened up. I did have to replace one of these. In fact, actually it might be this one, because the engine that we're rebuilding here, I don't know what all of its history was. I got it from somebody else for free. It was laying in their yard. But somebody had tried to start it with water in it, and these rods on one of the banks, or one of the pistons, was bent. And it wasn't this extreme, but it was like this. This is one out of one of my old engines. But now this engine experienced catastrophic failure, but this is an exaggerated version of what I'm talking about. That rod and the piston would be down here was bent because you cannot compress fluids. So that's a death knell for an engine. If you get a significant amount of fluid or anything like that down inside that bore and you try and spin it under power, it's going to bend those. Even though they're cast iron, they're going to bend. So we've got our old push rods here, water pump, timing cover. There's the old crankshaft, cylinder heads. So I'm pull the valve cover off here. These cylinder heads are already set up with comp cam springs in them, and I believe, are these 1.6s or no? These are stock rockers. So it's going to have plain old rockers in it. But I mean, if we ever really want to, we can put some 1.6 rollers in it or something. It's a little expensive. Intake manifold, fuel rail, upper plenum, distributor, and this is the block. So this is the basis for our build. And what I wanted to show you is if you look down in these bores, so like I said, I ran a hone through them, and they're not beautiful. I need to wipe them out, spray them out with that brake clean like I bought. But I think they're good enough. Basically, there is pitting in a few places in these. You can see down inside this bore, we've got pitting. This bore, we've got a little bit from where water sat in it. This one's really kind of the ugliest. You can see it looks really bad. But two things. One, it's all the way up here at the top of what they call the dwell. So the piston is actually not spending much time moving in this top part. In fact, that's why you have this shiny bit. That's where that's the part where the piston never goes past. So up above it is where it actually, when it's all the way up the top before it fires, that's the amount of compression, is that space between the piston and the cylinder head. But this looks awful, but my nail can't catch it. And like I said, I ran a hone through it. We're going to hope for the best. All of these have been gone through with a hone just to clean them up. Now, the one nice thing that I do know is since these haven't been bored at any point, if we ever decide we want to, we can tear the whole thing down and we can actually bore it out. It's got plenty of cylinder wall to do that. Up here, we've just got the pulleys, main caps, all the bolts and stuff associated with assembly, exhaust manifolds, oil pan, bracketry. So let's go ahead and get started on this. I'm going to spray this thing down. Well, flip it over, kind of spray it down, wipe it out, and then we can see about putting it together. We're going to start with the crankshaft and go from there. So let's go and spray these out. Basically, we're just trying to clean these bores because they've been sitting now for quite some time in the garage for, closed up, like had cylinder heads sitting on top, but stuff gets down in there. You can see on the rag. Just sits for a while and you end up with just kind of dirt and whatnot in there. And while you're going to get debris in an engine a little bit, very fine dirt debris in it as it runs, that is what an air filter is trying to prevent, and that is something you want to try and keep out. Also on fresh startup, even though our bores, like I said, are not the nicest in the world, we do want to give it the best chance we can. So just clean them up. I am hoping that these cylinder bores will be okay. I don't particularly like them. If I had, honestly, if I had more money, it's one of those things, if you had all the cash in the world, I would take this block off and have it machined. But the problem you run into is every time I've ever had a block machined, even if it was a really fairly minor thing, they always, they'll tell you, yeah, you can buy 10 overboard rings and all this. Pretty much every machine shop I've ever been to just wants to punch it all the way, go 30 over. Well, when you do that, you have to get bigger pistons. So you need a whole new set of pistons. You either need to, and then you basically need to pay somebody to press new pistons on your old rods, and it's going to add another $500 or more to this whole build. So that's something that it starts to snowball. The whole thought process behind doing this in the first place was I had half the parts or more laying on the shelf. So we're going to see how this all works out. I know how to do this all correct, but, you know, we're just going to kind of do the best we can. I'm going to go ahead and hose these out. These are the lifter bores. This is where your lifters sit. And I need to get down in here. Just want to get where the cam bearings, which this is the only time we will look at them. Actually, let me pull that off. There's a cap on the back there. Be good to remove. It's the rear cam cap on these. On these GM products, or at least this particular one, it's a cap with 3 screws that hold it. And what I'm doing, or what I'm trying to do, is just get these cam bearings, like get the debris and stuff out of them, so that when we go put a camshaft in here in a minute, we're not going to have debris sitting in there on our cam, tearing up bearings and stuff like that any more than they already are. Technically, you're supposed to replace the bearings that go in here when you do any rebuild. But they're a huge deal. Again, machine shop work, basically. I mean, you can get a tool, but I wouldn't take the risk. I'd pay a shop to put cam bearings in it. But that's another $200-300 you're going to be paying someone to put in this engine. And I'm speaking from experience. You can find yourself way over budget real quick if you just start paying people, just giving them a blank check to do whatever work the internet tells you need to do. And the internet's not wrong, but sometimes you don't quite need all of it. Bigger one. Knock this off real quick, just so I can get access in here. There we go. That came off. I'll have to gasket that again. Hose it out. All right. Just cleaning all it out a little bit. Flip it over and let this stuff kind of run out. Nope, I'll have to pick those up. Now this still has the old crankshaft bearings in it. We can take them out before we put new ones in. Now, everything and anything you do with an engine, you want to try and be as gentle as you reasonably can be. Don't get too aggressive with stuff. You can kind of knock stuff around to clean it out. So you've got a little bit of engine education here real quick. Let me get one of these free. Okay. So you basically got a couple different kinds of bearings that go in these. And these are what are called the main bearings. This is what holds the crankshaft when it sits in the car. But you have these, these are just the normal main bearings. They don't have these walls on them. And you need to make sure whenever you're doing assembly, you know where these things need to go. Pay attention, like this one's got a lip here to show you where this one goes. This is what's called a thrust bearing. So these things need to go in a very particular order. If you put these things in the wrong way, stuff like that, you're going to start binding. Now, they do tend to help you out. So just pay attention to, obviously, these holes. If it's got a hole in it, the hole needs to coincide with a hole or journal on these what are called on these journals. So these are the crank journals. It needs to line up with, the hole needs to line up with it, because that's where your oil is going to go. Your oil runs through all these little galleries and comes out through these. You also got a little tang, if you could see that right there. The little tang needs to line up with a tang in the block. And typically what you're going to see with these is they go to tang. And we'll show you that in a minute with these guys, which these are the caps that go on. These are what go on the outside of it. These, notice they've got a little tang on them as well. And you're always going to put tang to make sure that they go in the correct orientation. Now, the reason you have what are called thrust bearings, these, is because really more for manual transmissions than anything else. If an engine is ever going to be mated in such a way that it'll have a manual transmission, there has to be at least one thrust bearing in it. And what this does is, when the clutch is back here in the clutch fork, when you press it, depresses the clutch so that all that's working, clamping and unclamping and whatnot, that's putting forward force on the crankshaft. And part of the crankshaft needs to ride somewhere that isn't the block, because if it does, even if the block were perfectly machined for it and very nice, it would eventually wear out the block and you wouldn't be able to add anything to it. But if you make a bearing with that, then the crankshaft can be pressed into this. You can change these bearings. You can potentially change a crankshaft if it's wore out, but you're not going to have to throw away a whole block, because like this lip here basically got burned into it by a crank. And you can't put anything there now. So in any case, these are old bearings. These are junk now. Just be thrown away. Put them up here for a moment. Knock this other one out. These things should not be like super hard to remove. You just kind of give them a light tap. They should come out. And you can look at the wear on them too. So basically what you want to see is, usually the way they look when they're new is this kind of matte silver finish. That'll look pretty normal. And the reason that has almost no wear is it's on the sides. Gravity pulls that crankshaft down. It's not and it's riding in here usually. It's not really pushing much there. Now, the shinier bit, this is as it starts to wear in. There's a couple little nicks where maybe stuff got in the oil. And then you see down here the color changes again. This is where your heavier wear is, because this is where all the weight rests. You see a little bit of a color change. That's because you're burning through these bearings. Now, these bearings are actually, I mean, we're going to change them because they're cheap, but these aren't really that bad. When they're really wore out, what you'll start seeing is, because they're brass, typically, you'll start seeing brass coming through. And that means that it's shot. There's nothing else there. Now, and I also know this block's never been touched, and the way I know this block's never been bored out without miking it, or I can reasonably assume that, is I look at things like these bearings. So these bearings don't have an aftermarket company on them. Okay. They also say GM, I don't know what A200 denotes, and some other stuff, but they don't have anything on here that indicates an overbore. And if someone were rebuilding this engine, they likely wouldn't have GM bearings. They would be sealed power or something to that effect. And I can actually, let me see if I can pull a new one out and show it to you. So you can see them. These are two different bearings for different spots in the engine, but you can see them. So get the light right where you can actually see. It's going to be a pain. But you can see they are different. There's a different company logo up there. I don't know if you can, there you go. In any case, in this one, just says standard because it's a standard bearing. Doesn't have any special, it's not what they call undersize. So, or rather, what they call oversize. So what they do is, it's undersizing if it's the crank, it's oversized if it's the bearings. So what you do is, let's say the crankshaft is wore out, it's got wear to it. You can, if the cranks are valuable enough or hard enough to find, you can put them up in a lathe and you can cut a little bit out of the bearing journals. And the crank becomes undersized. These replace them, you would get new ones that are oversized, whatever the specification was. And you would look at the back. So the machinist, whenever they would do that, would mic the crank, know how much that they machined off, and then they would get the correct bearings and reassemble it. And then you would take these out, look at the stampings on the back. If they say standard, then it's a standard sized bearing. But if it's an oversized bearing for an undersized crank, then it'll say something. It'll be like, 10 over, dot 010 over, dot 020 over, whatever. But it'll have a number on there. These are just, that's probably technically GM saying it's slightly oversized, like .016, but these are original. They haven't been replaced, and that's actually, we can probably reasonably assume 87 on there indicates that's a 1987 bearing, which would fit. It's a 2.8 block. They were built in 87. They were built from 80, well, in Fiero is 85 to 88. But in any case, we can go to starting to put these new guys in. So let me get the assembly lube. We'll knock some of these in here, and then we'll get the crankshaft ready to set in here. Okay, so update. I'm not sure exactly what happened or what the issue is, but these these crank bearings do not belong to this engine. So this is the original one. Notice where the tang is and everything, and it's snug. It fits like it's supposed to. It doesn't want to, This is the replacement. It looks, from a glance, to be the same. Tang's in the wrong place, and it just kind of, I don't know what that goes to. It's something very similar to this engine. And when I ordered these, I ordered everything by application. So I don't know how it could possibly be that those are like 95% size replicas of the correct bearings. Now, going back to, again, the correct thing to do would be to stop here, order parts. But I already checked, and the rod bearings are correct. So these are the only bearings that are incorrect. And when I look at these, like I was talking about wear, these aren't what I would call happy. I mean, they're not great, but if anything, they look like they've basically just worn through their initial coating. Nothing on these looks like, I've seen them when they're real bad, when you start getting into the brass and they start getting completely worn out. These, man, I don't want to put them back, but I don't want to wait also either. It's going to be a week or two till I get new ones, and to be perfectly honest, this car is going to see maybe 1,000 miles a year. These look about like the ones I put back in the Dodge when I resealed it years ago. So I feel comfortable we can drop these back in here. This is one of those things, like if you're doing this for yourself, you take your own risks in your own hands. If you want it all perfectly right and you run into this problem, you need to stop and order parts. I don't think this is going to be, honestly, much of an issue. Especially we're cutting enough corners here. I don't think this is going to be that big a problem. And there aren't any huge problems with these bearings as they are. So we're going to pretend these are new bearings and we're going to reinstall them. And we'll go from there. So when you're installing these, again, you just make sure that the bearings fit and they belong. Make sure the tang lines up. And I've got it, and you can basically just roll press them right in, or you should be able to. And then they'll sit down in these channels and be flush across the top. That's all you're looking for. And don't be too worried about, like, is it microscopically perfectly flush? Because when you put that crank, the main cap on, it'll flatten it out. I mean, you just don't want it like, let's see, can I see? I'll do it with another one. You just don't want it sitting in here, like all wampus, and like, don't put it in like that, right? Try and get a little more level, but you can just kind of get it in there where it needs to be. Make sure it's reasonably level, and your main cap will take care of the rest. This is not the right way to do this, but it will do. Toss it in with yours. All right, let's drop that in there. Like I said, I'm not crazy happy with these, but they're going to have to do what they're going to have to do. Okay. So now this is engine assembly lube. If you are building an engine, you're going to need something like this. A whole bunch of different manufacturers make it. This is just the stuff I've got. It is just basically a nasty, syrupy lubricant to ensure that your engine doesn't start up like dry. The idea is it's tacky, it's sticky, it'll coat like the insides of these bearings, but it doesn't just run off of them. I mean, I know I've heard old school tricks about like, nah, just put motor oil in there. You know, I guess if that would work, if you're going to assemble it and fire it kind of the same day, but this is much better. And it's not that expensive, just get some. It's fine. And you'll use it for other things. Assembly lubricant's handy for all kinds of stuff. Just lubricate your crankshaft bearings, your new ones, right? Right? Then, you know, they're new. Don't worry about it. Fine. Okay. Put a little bit. Okay, so they're slippery and ready to go. All right, we can set our crankshaft in here. So let me go grab that. So right here, we're just going to gently set your crank in and just let it set down in your bearings. Now, you shouldn't have any issues at this stage, but go ahead and rotate it. Make sure everything rotates freely and smoothly. You can wipe down and clean up stuff. Just, you know, make sure there's no interferences, everything fits. Again, our crank isn't resurfaced or anything. It's just the way it came, and it's shiny. I think it'll be okay. So let me go ahead and now another thing that we could do that we're not going to do. I did say we got a new timing set. I'm going to leave the old gear on the crank. I could pull it off and put a new one on. I don't see any wear on this thing. This old timing gear looks just fine. We'll change the big one and we'll change the chain. And really the chain is the part that you really care about. And we'll get to that here in a little bit, but I'm going to leave the old timing gear on here. And we're just going to go ahead and put our main bearings on. So grab these guys and we'll wipe them down. Since we're just doing apparently the old ones now, I'll just wipe them out and leave them in place. Don't worry about taking them out. I will lubricate them. I'll put assembly lube on them. So this assembly lube's pretty old. It's from I don't know, probably my last engine build, like in it's been a while, like 2015 or so, no, 18, 17 or 18, I think is the last time I assembled one. When you're installing these main caps, make sure they go back in the same order and orientation that they came out. You don't want these things twisted around or doing anything, you know, unfortunate. One of the things to consider or to know about engines when you're assembling them is that best practice is basically that everything goes back the way it came out. Even if you do change these bearings and you put a new crank in it and all that stuff, you want to try to make sure that when you assemble stuff, you assemble it in the exact same orientation it came out. Because everything is kind of machined together when an engine is built, and certainly when an engine is rebuilt. So you want to do everything you can to ensure that everything's in the correct orientation. And you'll find that these caps are numbered. So let me see if I can find the number. Yeah, so this is actually our number 1 cap. All right, so it's got a number 1 right here, and I know that that's the correct number for the number 1. Because I look at these other ones, I got number 3 on this one. Okay. This one's going to be number 2. Hope you can see that. And on the back one, we always know it's number 4, at least in this case. It's important that these things all go back in the correct orientation. We don't want something out of order. They also need to be oriented the correct direction. Now, this back one's very simple, but if they have any arrows on them or anything like that, you want to make sure that that is put in facing the front of the engine. So like this one has a number 1 and it has an arrow facing forward, so I know it goes there. And that's actually kind of important that it has it that way, because this engine has been apart for quite some time. I've actually really almost forgotten how it, these parts certainly have been moved around a lot, so I can't be certain that they're in the same orientation in the box that they came out. So we're just going to put these on. You're really don't worry about like overdoing it with the assembly lubricant. You can't really have too much. All right, this last one, wipe this out. Yeah, that one's not the best thing in the world, but it'll do. Again, I should probably do better, but this is this is the swap stage. This is not a full rebuild for the rest of time, which I guess is the way I should look at it. But in my experience, these old things, even if you do, I've had builds I've done absolutely everything right, and then 3 months later, it's all coming apart again. So, all right, so put your bolts in, make sure that they line up and spin down. These, I don't believe, are one-time use. When you get to the cylinder heads, they're actually one-time use. They're what are called torque to yield, and we'll get to that later. But basically, they're not meant to be reused. These guys are not torque to yield, as far as I'm aware. So you can just kind of take them out, put them back in. We'll grab the right size socket pad, we'll torque them. Now, something I wanted to show you too. If you're doing one of these engine builds, you can get a lot of this information off the internet, but I still advise actually having a manual. These things are extremely handy. You can tell mine's pretty weathered. But like for engine assembly, I just go in here, and if I want torque specs for everything, which we're going to need, I can look at the torque specs by year. I can look at them for crankshaft, pistons, cylinder heads, everything. So all the specifications are in here. These things are also really great because they go through a lot of diagnostic related stuff just on paper, exploded diagrams to show you how everything goes together. Having one of these books on hand is really kind of invaluable. I've had mine for years and years, and you can actually, some of my pages are actually starting to fade. It's kind of cool actually when they start to get this old. Main bearing bolts, 84, or all of them really. If it's a 6-cylinder, every year there's 63 to 74 pound-feet. So that's what we're going to set our torque wrench to, and we'll torque them down. All right. So because I've worked on cars for a long period of time, and even professionally, I have some tools that y'all might not have, but truthfully, it works the same as any other cheap torque wrench. You're just going to set your torque spec to where you need it to be, and then you can go to town on these bolts and actually tighten them down. Now let me grab a normal ratchet, and we're going to spin them down so that they're snug. Once they're snug, we can go from there and actually start torquing them. Okay, so we've got these guys in place now. The bolts are run in. I'm going to run them down. Now what you're going to want to do is just go ahead and spin them down until they're snug. You could use like an little electric impact, like a quarter drive one, to do this. Personally, I prefer on reassembly with engines. I don't want to touch this thing with anything but a hand tool. I want everything just come down nice and smooth. I don't want to have to run the risk of hurting anything, even though they make so little torque. But just make sure they go down even. And we'll set the actual torque spec like what was in the book here in a second. I'm just going to get them down so that they're snug, so that We know that it's all the way down. And before we torque it, we'll go ahead and rotate the crank again, make sure the crank moves freely. If at any point in this, any of the rotating assembly starts to bind and doesn't want to turn, then we've got a clearance issue. We've got something we need to address. Either we've got a bearing that's the wrong size, installed incorrectly, hanging up, something, but all of this should rotate smoothly. If everything's orientated the way it came out and everything is within spec or close to within spec, you shouldn't have any issues with anything rotating. So it should rotate freely. I'll show you that in just a second. And I am by no means a professional engine builder. I've just managed to put together a few over the years that are still running. Okay. So you can see, even though I've tightened these down, right? Like, I mean, I haven't gone to kill, but these are hand tight. All right. I can still rotate the crankshaft freely. Any resistance I have, I've got a little bit of drag, but it's not really resistance, it's just a little bit of drag. And that drag is honestly, it's just the assembly lube. But it should all rotate nice and smooth. And that way you know that it's all, like, this is all going to actually rotate and run well. So let me grab my torque wrench. Now you will probably have a simpler torque wrench than I do. My torque wrench is this big thing. But I have this because I actually worked on cars professionally for quite some time. And honestly, it's just fun to own really cool tools. But to be perfectly honest, your standard clicky type, even the Snap-on one, I'd argue is better. I've had more issues with this little display and solder joints, and it looks neat. Honestly, it's overkill. But it will do our job today. So it sets our torque. So you can probably see the number there. We're going to rotate it. Get my foot on it. We want to do it kind of evenly. So I'm going to bring them down to 30. And you really want to work your way actually out from the middle. I'm just getting them down close to start. So I'm not too worried about it. Bring them all down to about 30 pound-feet. 30-ish. And we're going to start in the middle. So we're going to go with this guy. We're going to go, I've got it set to that 70 pound-feet. We're going to go to 50. I like to bring all this stuff down nice and even. I suppose you could probably get away with just one and done. But if you've ever broken one of these bolts before, you'll be a little... Never broken one down here, but I have broken them up in the cylinder head before. And I'll tell you that is not a good day. So just torque everything nice and even. So this is equivalent to a clicky one clicking. It'll beep. I'll get the green light, and you can see as it comes on torque. That's one of the slightly neat things about this style torque wrench. I mean, it's neat. I don't think it's a bit more than you probably need. But when you are setting torque with these, always go ahead. So you set your torque, always just rock it back once or twice. Make sure you're at torque, because you can end up where it got a kind of a poor read just the way you were going down. But I don't think we're going to have any issues today. Any more issues. And like I said, once we're down to torque, I'm going to rotate this crank again, make sure it still moves freely, that our main caps are not unevenly cranked or tightened down. Okay, turn that off for now. Yep, we still move freely. So now we have, these guys are torqued down to spec, and we don't need to worry about them anymore. And it moves freely, moves smoothly. So the next thing we're going to do is we're going to flip it over. I'm going to grab my piston ring compressor tool and we're going to start knocking pistons into this thing. Okay, flip this over. And as you start assembling this more and more, be careful because you're going to make it start going to get heavier and heavier and top heavy. And you really don't want to tip this whole thing over. Stuff falling down. Wipe these out one more time on our janky, trashy rebuild. What do you guys think? You think it's going to survive? I mean, people who've known me have known I've had mixed luck with that. But arguably, most of my mixed luck has been when things have been, when you've done it to the best, like with the best intentions, bought all new stuff. I actually had more luck doing stuff kind of trashier than I have doing it right. Okay. So, next thing we're going to go ahead and start smacking pistons into this thing. Okay. So, for those of you that haven't ever messed with a piston or understood these things, this is a piston. Well, specifically, this is the piston rod, and this is the piston rod cap. Okay, so the way this works is this goes around the crankshaft onto one of the, like, I guess the journals on it. And as the crankshaft turns, it's going to force it up and down inside the bore. You have on the end of it the actual piston. And if these have to be replaced, the way you do this is this has to be put in a vise. And these forget the term off the top of my head, but these kind of pivots here need to be pressed out so that you can replace these. A lot of times, if you go to press these out, you're going to break these. So I mean, it makes sense you're putting new pistons in, but these don't generally survive the process when you take them apart. And since we're staying with a standard bore, we know this engine hasn't been rebored. We can stick with the old pistons. I basically clean these up using gasoline. It's just about the cleanest or the cheapest degreaser you can find anywhere. You can use gunk, you can use brake cleaning, you can use all that stuff. It works great. I would advise, like with any cleaning petroleum products, wear gloves, because once or twice isn't a huge deal, although it does irritate your hands. Even I have to admit that decades of soaking your hands in petroleum products is probably not a good thing. I've seen so many people get arthritis, possibly just from, all the little contortions you do doing this job, but still, do something. Try and extend your life. In any case, so the way these work is you have 3 grooves here on the piston. These are oil scraper, and I'll show you those in a second. Then you have a secondary compression ring and a primary compression ring. And basically the way that these work is these two are responsible only for making sure that there's compression within the engine. When this is going up and down, that it doesn't have blow by or leak past it. That's what blow by is when the rings are bad or the bores are so bad that the combustion can blast past. Then you have the oil scrapers, and they're basically 2 little rings and a corrugated ring, and they're going to ride here in this bottom channel. And their job is just to, as oil is flung around inside the engine, they allow oil to kind of spread up and down the cylinder walls, but they're going to scrape it. They're going to keep it from just being constantly soaked with it. So let me get the box out, show you what this looks like. Okay, so when you buy piston rings, you're generally going to get a box like this. Make sure you get a set, not just one. The box doesn't really matter anymore, but you'll get them and they're numbered. So you have obviously 1, 2, 3, and 4. And inside of all of these is all your various different rings. I'll pull these out and I'll show you. And piston rings come in all different kinds of flavors. These, I believe, are just standard cast iron piston rings. You can get really bougie, and you can get very fancy ones that are like moly and all kinds of space-age materials. It just depends on what grade and what level you're building to. In our case, we're really kind of staying at that lower end budget stuff. So, but what you've got here, these very thin rings, and you're going to have a lot of them. These are your oil scraper rings. So you pull these apart. They're very thin. If I can get it apart. There we go. But basically what goes in this groove is going to be this corrugated ring and two of these. These are the oil scrapers. Then you have your actual compression rings. These are going to be your thicker ones. In most applications, they're going to be pretty much the same. You're not going to see any real difference between the primary and the secondary rings. They're just basically boxed up or bagged up separate so that you know which, that you have enough of them, basically. Typically, your primaries will have like a dot on them or something to that effect to indicate that they're the primary ring, but you're not generally going to see all that much of a difference. One of the other things that you'll see sometimes, depending on the ring and how high performance your application is, I don't know that you're going to be able to see it on this, and these might be, they bevel the outside of the ring. So you have the outer edge of this ring is actually at a slight angle, and that's obviously so that when the piston comes up, it's got a slight bevel to it. It's assisting with that compression as opposed to them being flat. Not all rings are going to be like that. It's going to depend on your application. And I've even seen, rebuilding these over the years, I've seen plenty that were flat, and I've seen, like, it looks like these ones actually have a little bit of a bevel to them. But I'll show you how to put these on. You do need to be kind of careful when you're installing these because they are, you can break them, especially these cast ones. Move these out of the way. Stability. And actually just to make me a little more comfortable. Well, we'll try it without. I've got one spare set of rings, so if I break some, well, I don't want to, I can deal with it. Okay, so what you're going to have are these oil scrapers. Always look at your rings, make sure there isn't somewhere that does say that it's this side up or something like that. Generally speaking, with the oil scrapers, it's really not, there's not going to be anything on them. There's not going to be anything to indicate that. But the way you want to install these rings is you always start with one corner, right? Get an edge on there and gently work it around. Because like I said, you can snap them. It's going to drop into there first. Just press it out, pull it out again, work your way down to the next channel. It'll drop into that second compression ring channel, and then just one more time, drop it down into the oil scraper channel. Same deal with the corrugated ring, the oil scraper ring. Again, always look and see if there's something that indicates top or bottom. It's really, to be perfectly honest, not going to matter. And this one, you're really not likely to break. You just push it down and get it in, as long as it goes into the channel it's supposed to go into, and it is sitting in here without any significant interference. Everything has to sit in here flush. So actually, you know what? It's been a while since I built one of these. I don't know I've ever noticed that, and I don't know that maybe not all of them are like this, but this one at least does have, let's see, where we're going to put the corrugated ring in first, because it's got these little teeth on the back, and those are going to fight the scraper. So same deal, put it on, slide it on the piston. It's nice and loose on here, and now we can rock our oil scraper ring on. This is kind of a time-consuming process, putting rings on pistons. You just kind of have to have your patience with it, because to be honest, if you start getting in a hurry, you are going to break these. The oil scrapers, not as much. They're pretty forgiving because they're very thin, very flexible. Pretty sure these are actually just made out of like stamped steel, but it's those compression rings that you're going to have to be careful with, because if you snap them, I mean, obviously they're worthless, and you're buying another set of piston rings, which, well, it's not the end of the world. You know, I'd rather be spending my money on other things. Put this one on. Get it down in the channel. All right. Cool. So that's how that works now. Now you see you've got a lower scraper, the corrugated ring, and the upper scraper in there. Now, a lot of people make a big deal out of these things being clocked, and we'll get to that in a second a little more. Truthfully, once this thing is running, it's not going to matter. And what they mean by clocking is, you may or may not be able to see it, but you remember these things have little gaps in them. And if all these gaps are lined up, presumably you're losing, especially on the compression rings, you could lose compression. But it's not going to matter. As these things run, these things spin. So it just, as long as they're on there, is really all that matters. So we're going to put our primary or secondary compression ring. That's going to be the bigger one that sits in this channel. You can also just test fit. In my case, it doesn't fit in the top one. It can only go in the bottom. And the dot's going to go up. So make sure, so like I said, these are the ones you have to be careful with. So take one end, stick it, kind of press it into it, and just start working it around. It's, get it over the edge there. They make tools that help with this, make it a lot easier. But even those, you got to be careful, because if you overstretch the ring, you're going to snap it. So there we go, down there. Just work your way around, and boom. All right, so we've got a compression ring in here. So once this, and it looks very loose on here. These in generally are, but once it's down in the bore, it's going to press it tight. Okay. Test fitting is kind of a big deal when you're doing all of this. If stuff doesn't want to fit, don't force it. You know, take a step back, figure out where stuff needs to go. Okay. So we've got the right rings on the right ones. Truthfully, again, and I'm using terms like primary and secondary rings and all of this. In a lot of these cases, they really are kind of idiot proof. One's going to fit in one channel, one's going to fit in another, and you really kind of can't get it wrong. But now you can really see what we're talking about with the clocking. I wouldn't deliberately put it in an engine like that with them lined up, but they are going to pass each other as it runs. There's nothing to hold these. So ideally, when you go to put these in the engine, we'll just put them, you know, clocked apart from each other. So I'm going to stop annotating this. I'm going to just go ahead and throw all these together, get them ready for assembly, and then we can start smacking these into the engine and get that much closer to having a rebuilt 2.8 liter V6.
Shutting down, everyone's gathered round, heading to the fairgrounds to see us a show. Got an AM country station blaring out a tune on the radio. Floats in street parades, waving beauty queens, local folks raising Cain, and the beer's ice cold. Everyone's shaking hands, saying hello to everyone they know. Yeah, the smell of charcoal, cooking up burgers and dogs. That's America. It's a fireworks stand on the 4th of July. Bottle rockets popping, lighting up the sky. Got old glory flying way up high. America, that's America. It's a red, white, and blue flag painted on the barn. Lawn chairs and bonfires out in the yard. Under the stars is where we give our thanks today. Down in small town USA.
Last thing I want to do before we start putting these things in the actual engine is we want to change out these rod bearings on here, right? That go in. These are what actually ride on the crank. Now, some things to keep in mind here and stuff that I've already touched on, but you need to remember. When you take these out, when you put them together, these need to stay in the same orientation and with the same piston that they came from. So there's a lot of tricks for this. This person right here, it's number 2. I marked it on the top out of my engine, right? I took a little grinder and ground it in there. but this was stamped from the factory, and you can see 2-2. So this was rod number 2 for this engine, and they stamped it on that side to show they're supposed to go together. Okay, these don't have to be like fully tightened because they're not on the engine yet, but tang to tang, and they're in here together. So now these can be assembled. This is a really good way to do it. Some manufacturers might do that from the factory. It might indicate someone's been in your engine before. It just kind of depends. But like if you look at this one, when I had this apart, obviously I was a little haphazard with it. The 2 doesn't match with the other 2. Okay. Now why they used 2, I have no idea, because this was piston number 5 out of my engine. So I got no idea. The numbers could just be whatever was handy. But you can also tell by looking at it that it's backwards, because even though this side, it's been sitting in a box for a while. Get it off. Get stuck. Even though it's been sitting in a box for a while, and they were like that, and I'm like, well, I don't know. Notice this one has a tang. The tang wasn't lined up with the tang that's on this one that you can see there on its old bearing. And if you pop the bearing out, you can see it's got a tang as well. And that'll show you, at least on these GM things, I think most things, that it's tang to tang. Okay. So I'm going to start pressing all these little new rod bearings in. These all seem to fit. I'm not exactly sure what the incompatibility or what was going on with the parts I ordered for the crank bearings. Like I said, I'm using used ones, which I'm not a huge fan of, but I will say this one defense for it. I don't have them on hand. I already kind of put them in the bin, but the ones that were on the crank actually did say they had GM on them, which indicated to me they've never been changed, but they did have a weird number on them that was like 0.016. Well, no one makes a 0.016 oversized crank bearing. Not that I can find anywhere. They start at 0.025. And on the off chance that that's some weird mismatch too, I'm perfectly fine putting those bearings back in, considering they have the wear on them was pretty minimal. Nothing looked all that bad. These have no oddball markings I'm not familiar with. These are just GM, and then whatever. They don't indicate anything that looks to me like they were over or undersized for an oddball size crank. So I don't know, but these should be fine. Let me go ahead and get these switched out, and then we can start putting pistons in the motor. All right, so all of these are in. Now you might have seen me when I was taking these and just kind of smacking them on the table here. For concussive, the way these things are, because these obviously it's very rigid the way these are together. Everything should be perfectly straight. You shouldn't have any problems with everything. Should slide right on and off perfect. That's not necessarily exactly how the world works, and there might be just a little bit. And hell, even if you go put these things on, if you're not like laser machine straight, you'll put them in a bind. So sometimes just a little smack on the table, something like that, to just kind of concussively shake them loose is all you need to do. What you may need to make sure is just that these studs are not all bent or wonky or something. If they are, I suppose they could be pressed out and replaced. But truthfully, unless you know that they were just bent later, if there's something wrong with them, you're probably better off replacing the actual piston rod, because just for peace of mind, because that way you know this hasn't been damaged. Because if this is out of whack, you can actually end up tearing up other stuff in the engine. And I'll show you that in a second too when we go to start assembly, that it is possible to put this in backwards. And if you do that, you can actually damage things. So I'll show you that here in just a second. They make catch pans that you can put underneath to catch things like dripping oil. And I actually used to have one. Don't have it anymore. But I'm just going to take a little bit of this and just wipe it all in here, just kind of slippery, make the bores slippery. And I'll dip the pistons in before I actually put them in. But you want to do this just because, you know, you've got fresh, shiny cylinder bores, at least ideally, you know, with the pretty cross hatching and all that. Not that we do, but some people do, right? And when you do this, you want them to be protected. You don't want to tear these up. And any oil that's in here, they naturally get oiled while it runs, but it'll also burn off once it actually starts. And honestly, unless you're starting it the same day you're putting it together, a lot of this is going to run down into the pan as well by the time you actually ever start this thing. So let me keep oiling it up. And like I said, I'm just using, this is just some old 020 I have laying around for the Toyota in the fleet that, you know, that's how Toyotas are. They don't ever need anything, so I don't generally need the oil as much. But there are better ways to do this. Like I'm sure there's a sprayable piston ring break-in lubricant and all that, but this will do. This will get your pistons in. So, all right. So we've got our bores kind of oiled up and slippery. You go ahead now. We'll get a piston set up, get it dipped in some oil so that it'll be like what we need it to be, and we can tap it in. All right. Remember, like I said, order matters, right? So that was fun. Sure that won't happen again. I just want to have it a little more straight up and down if I can for smacking these in. But remember, order matters. So I labeled mine. Remember how you labeled them when you took them out. Generally speaking, rule of thumb though is number one is always going to be to the front side of the engine. The farthest forward cylinder. In this case, it's on this bank, and it happens to be this one. So that's going to be cylinder number one. And we also know from just research and everything and the way it came out, or at least I do, these dots go forward. So this piston has to go in that orientation. Now this matters because if you look at the way these things are, at first glance, this all appears like round as round, right? It appears even. But if you look very closely, and if you look at these dots that are cast into it, you'll notice one is closer on one side. And the way it's made, this is not actually even. This is actually offset very slightly. And I can tell you from experience, from an engine I've put together, if you don't have these in the correct orientation, where they're in the facing the right way, you can tear the cylinder walls up. Now there's some old school hot rod tricks where guys explain this stuff where if you take all the pistons, right, it has to be all of them, and flip them around, you now have more mechanical advantage. Well, depending on this offset, right? Some engines are a little different. You can get more mechanical advantage, and you can actually get a little more torque and a little more power at the sacrifice of your cylinder walls. Sometimes, you know, it might shorten the life of the engine, but you'll get a little bit more out of it. Safe thing to do if you want this thing to live a long time is put it in the way the factory intended it. Where I made a mistake was it was my first engine build, and I didn't actually know any of that. And I was just knocking pistons into this thing thinking, well, it goes down. Well, it turns out I put 3 of them in when I took it apart backwards with the holes like that. And what it meant was that engine was completely out of balance. Oddly enough, it ran really well. It tore up its cylinder walls. It had a ton of blow by. It was not happy. It's possible if all of them were the wrong way around, it might not tore the cylinder walls up as bad. But it shredded the cylinder walls on a couple bores, and that whole engine was junk after that. So remember what orientation these need to go in, and make sure they go back the same way. So we're going to take these off because we need these caps off so it can wrap around the crank. And I am going to go ahead and also put just a little bit of assembly lubricant on this as well. And that is so that, because you'll see in a second, when I put it down there, it's going to start going for that crank journal, and I want to just already have the assembly lubricant on it so that first time this thing starts, it doesn't start up dry. Apparently they're doing something outside. All right. So, you know, if you got a little extra, it doesn't hurt. Just put a little assembly lube in the bore and clean it right off. You can also put it in lifter bores, just wherever, just get it out of the way. All right. So like I said, let me go ahead and dip it. And this might be a little messier than you actually need to do, but my preference is to do it. I want to make sure that everything is slippery as possible when it goes in here, because I don't want failures, right? I want this thing to live. So, dribble. We'll run off a bit. Okay, we'll call that good. Okay. And it's going to drip some more. But, so I want, there, loosen this up a little more. The way you loosen these up is you push down on that little knob and you can rotate it back and loosen it. And, let's see here. So I'm going to slip this over the piston. Stick my little tool back in here. Tighten it down. Like I said, we want it tight enough to compress the rings so that everything will sit in here flush. And remember, the dots go forward in this application. So I'm going to gently place this down in the bore and make sure it sits down flat. Now I've got this compressed sheet metal ring is now flush with the head, or the block. It's a little hard for you to see from that angle, but make sure that this is smooth all the way around. It's not sitting up at some cockeyed angle or anything weird, that your piston, because you want it to go in as straight as possible. If this thing's not straight, you can break rings, you can gouge the cylinder walls, you can do all kinds of stuff that's going to basically make you have to work twice as hard and redo a lot of your work. Now once I'm in place, I do like to go ahead and just give it a little bit more tightening just to make sure that my rings are fully compressed. And depending on your application, you probably just go ahead and bonk it in. Make sure you're using something that's not really hard. We don't want to gouge the face of this. Although it's not generally going to matter very much, we don't want metallic debris in here breaking off. So you can see. And now something you want to keep in mind as we're going in, we're now pretty much in, right? It's not going to fall out. Pull that. Let me show you something. So, we want to ensure that this right here, that our piston, and you can see it actually, it's trying to do it. It rotated a little. We want to make sure that our piston is not going to gouge these journals. So in my case, because of where it is, I'm going to rotate it over. I've got it a little farther in than I want it to be. So I can't actually just rotate this into place because the journal's hit. So I'm going to keep it at a higher position and bonk it the rest of the way in carefully. This is where those socks come in hand. So you don't, if you have socks on these pieces, you don't have to worry about it gouging anything. And let's see if my ring compressor falls off, because we're now fully in the bore. Okay, all our rings are compressed and we're in. Now, let me see here. Maybe we have enough. I can rotate my crank. Yes, I can. And we just want to make sure, yep, it'll line up into its orientation. We now have a piston attached around a crankshaft. Now, what we want to do, since we're lined up, we take our hammer and we'll just go ahead and give it a couple more whacks. You'll hear it. That's solid. We're bottomed against the crank. Right? So now, comes the last part. So this is that main cap, right? Now this comes back to, again, remember, we need tang to tang or stamp to stamp, but we need to make sure that these things are lined up, all right? This is your last chance to check that your rod bearings and everything are in the correct orientation. And I can actually see on mine, mine has slipped just a little. So, press it down. And bear in mind what I'm doing right there. I'm not actually pressing on these journals, because remember, these are machine surfaces. We don't want those hurt. What I was doing was, if this was the bottom side of that piston, this was just pressed up literally like that. All I did was push it down. Just a quick little nudge to press it down and get it even on the crankshaft. We don't want to touch or do anything that can gouge any of these journals, because that's where you start getting premature wear. Okay, but I now have it lined up, and I can see that I've got the tank. Well, let me bring it in, I'll show you. Okay. So, you can see, right, we've got, this is the piston rod, okay, without its cap on, and it's around the crank. What I had done was take my screwdriver, try and get you right and see, and I had just taken it, sorry guys, and pressed that little bit down again. But I wasn't actually touching this surface, just pressing that down. And I know it's now even. And I know that that tang is on that side, right? That little tang. So I now know this guy is going to have to go with that tang, right, on that side. It's fairly simple. So let me put you back on the tripod here, and we'll go through, we'll start knocking all these pistons in, and we'll get it assembled, okay? Okay, so now we've got all of these installed. It's time for us to set the torque and actually torque them down correctly. We're going to go back to our handy little book, and we're going to look in here and find our spec. So, let's see, torque specifications, rod bearing bolts, and for 6 cylinders, they're all going to be the same every year. But rod bearing bolts, we're going to want for a 173 cubic inch, which is the 2.8, the 60-degree family, 34 to 40 pound-feet of torque. And that's every year. So I like to split the difference. We'll just put it at, call it 37, and we'll just call it good. So I've got the torque wrench turned on. Let me see. Now, let's do this. Okay. Correct socket helps a lot. All right. So no, that's the torque. Let me check this one. Yep, 37. 37. All right. Move outwards. I know I can get to this one. Like I said, just make sure everything is torqued evenly. You don't want to just run one side down all the way, and always confirm torque that you're actually there. I'm just going to do this side because I have to rotate it to get at the others, more than likely. Okay. Yeah, and I apologize for bumping the tripod. There's just no good way to lock this stand down and actually show you. But we're at 37, 37. I still got the front two to do, but I just want to make sure these are all still 37 pound-feet like they're supposed to be. Okay. Now, last thing I just need to do is rotate it over. Rotate it over. Yep. All right. Torque these. I'm going to basically high 20 on one side, get the other side to high 20, then coming back and doing the full to 37. But make sure. And always check your specific torque specs. I mean, this will work for these 2.8 GM engines, but everything's a little bit different. Okay, guys, let me give you a rundown on where we're at with camshafts. I've got a couple here. So I made a point at the beginning, I think, earlier on, that we were going to be reusing an old cam that I had laying around. And well, one, I'm behind, right? I meant to have this video out about almost a month ago, and we're pushing because just time and money, and I've been working a lot. But I've had a lot of times to sit here and think about it. So let me pull it out and show you. They're the same camshaft, the same part number from comp. This is an old one that came out of one of my old builds. And this was a build, I can't remember what failure point was on this one, if this was the one with the pistons in backwards or what, but this is the old camshaft. And I actually wrote this thing off. I had pulled it out of the car when I rebuilt it and actually just tossed it in the garage at my buddy's place and never thought about it again. Well, when we went to go start putting this build together, I thought about it and I was like, man, I'm trying to save money. I wonder, I walked over and it was a little rusty and I cleaned it up. Polished it a little bit with Scotch-Brite and oil, and I'll say it came back mostly pretty okay. I actually thought for a little while we could use it, but let me see here if I can show you. There's some stuff on here that I was a little bit concerned about. So if you look at this cam, you've got a little bit of pitting on it. I realize it's a little dark. I hope you can see. But we've got all this pitting on the camshaft, and these shiny bits are actually indicative of where the old lifters were riding. So, I mean, it's all actually pretty intact. I mean, and these are where the cam bearings ride, so I'm not as worried about them. And I thought for a little bit, maybe I can reuse this thing. Maybe, because you got ones like this that are actually in pretty good shape, right? But the more you look at it, and I just start getting nervous and nervous. Most notably, this one. So we can get it to focus. So if you look, there's actually a tiny bit of chipping there, and you can actually see the surface is almost slightly gouged. It's a little rough. It's possible that this cam was on its way out when that engine failed. These are what are called hydraulic flat tappet camshafts, and let me grab a lifter to show you. So the way these work is that, and I'll show you more, but this sits in the middle of the engine, and these guys, the lifters, these ride above it, and they ride directly on this surface. And as the engine spins, turn around so you can see, as the engine spins, it's going to push that up and down based on the lump, the little hump on the camshaft. It's a little hard to demonstrate, right? So it rides on them, on these high bits. But one of the things and the reason these have fallen out of favor is when everything's machined correctly, these actually work pretty well. One of the problems is that if the machining's not right, or they don't manage break-in quite right, you can actually do what's called flattening a cam. And they can also do this just from years and years of wear, but what happens is basically this lobe just shears apart and it just comes off and goes flat. I've actually got one I turned into a lamp at one point because that happened to me. And I'm just so nervous. Like I'm willing to take slight risks on the cylinder bores not being perfect and maybe reusing those crankshaft bearings and reusing the cam bearings and stuff. This, I'm just, after weeks and weeks of sitting around, I'm just nervous to use that. So, I don't know if this is destined to become a lamp as well or what, but for now, we're not going to use it. I bit the bullet, and I bought a brand new camshaft. This is the same spec, the same number from Comp. It's just produced much more recently. It's all nicely bagged up. It's got assembly lube. It's got everything it needs. And I'm just going to pull it out of here because I cut that off. So cute. It's like a little camshaft for a little motor. Well, 6-cylinder. Pull it off. But you can see this one's never been run before. This one's never been run. The surfaces are all matte because they've got like a anti-rust coating, and everything is new. So I'm hoping that this is going to be able to survive. Part of my concern as well with buying a new cam, and this is something that you need to consider. Like if you're rebuilding one of these and you're using these old flat tappet camshafts, this technology works. It's tried and true. It functions. There's nothing wrong with it. The problem is if the machining isn't right, you can lose basically your whole build because you're going to have to go back through when it sends metal through it and just hope for the best. And it sucks, right? So these things can go flat brand new. It just depends on if the lifters are machined correctly and the cam is machined correctly. And that's really where you're at on it. You're really kind of at the mercy of the parts. When you do start up on one of these, now they do make what are called roller cams. That's a whole nother family. But the difference with a roller cam, is that as it rides on here, right, it comes around, rollers actually have a little wheel. And the benefit of that is, one, you don't have a metal-to-metal contact that's super dependent on having the right oil mixture and things being machined well. But the benefit of that is, once, you don't have that friction, so it's less likely to flatten a cam, which is why they're far more common on modern vehicles. They're also basically no one's used these since the 90s. That no manufacturer has been putting flat tappet cams in anything really since the 90s. But you can also get these lobe profiles, because they have to just kind of push up on that metal, have to be fairly sharp and short. If you have a roller, you can have what's called duration, where this can be wider. It'll hold the valve open longer. And you can also have them higher, because since it can ride up and has less friction, you can really get more aggressive with your cam. Now, one of the problems is, and the way that has to work, is then you have to have something that holds these in the correct orientation, because if your roller's on here like this and it turns, it'll shear the cam just as bad, if not worse, immediately as one of these going flat. Now, the cool thing with these is once they're broke in, if they survive break-in, they will generally last a long time. This is it works fine, but so will a roller, right? And the rollers, as long as you've got the little thing that holds them in place, you never have a problem. So that's why these have died off. This was cheap, this was old, and in this country, when we used to machine things and build things with a certain amount of pride and quality, this worked fine. Plenty of performance applications have used these. Plenty of race cars have run these in the past. Fleets and fleets of family vehicles and normal working vehicles have run these. But it's just the day and age we live in, that the machining is just not good enough on a mass scale, and these things have fallen out of favor. And admittedly, rollers are a little better. I mean, there are some benefits. But all of that science aside, what we're going to do is I'm going to go ahead and oil this brand new camshaft up. We're going to put assembly lube on everything. It's going to get on all these lobes. It's going to get on all these bearing surfaces, and we're going to slip it in the front of the engine, and we should be good to go at that point. Yeah, so let me go ahead and get started on that, and I'll show you how that works. Alright, so you can see here I've got the new camshaft all covered in assembly lube. I only covered the parts that are going to go in the engine first. I left my handhold end of it ungreased for now. But you just want to make sure you've got grease on just about everything in here, because it's going to be your only opportunity to get this stuff lubricated. And do everything you can so this doesn't start up dry. If this were to start up dry, you could shear the camshaft pretty much immediately. So gently, you want to start it right here and just kind of ease it in. Be gentle with it. Try not to let it slam into any of the journals or anything real hard, because if you chip those bearings, you're in trouble. So just kind of work it through. I've got the cam plug out at the back, so I can also kind of guide it once it gets further in. But now I've got it settled here, I can add a little more assembly lube to the actual lobes, and then I can work it through on the back side. And I apologize, I'm kind of having to do this in post because my new external mic decided to not record this. So make sure you've got a nice healthy amount of assembly lube. Just want to work it around, apply it with your finger. And this one you really probably don't need to worry about in this. That's actually for running a mechanical fuel pump, that last lobe, which we don't need to worry about. But then just make sure so the last one for the cam bearings lubricated. Can't go overboard with it, and more the better. If there's extra, it'll just fall off somewhere else inside. There's no way you can put too much assembly lube. So now I'm going to grab kind of from the back, try and support it. So I'm going to put a screwdriver and grab the back of the cam. And we're just going to gently kind of put it the rest of the way into the block. Kind of fights a little bit, just work it. Don't get aggressive with it, just kind of work it slowly and guide it through. Banging into stuff really hard. I'm trying to make sure everything goes nice and smooth, or as smoothly as possible. There we go. We're in. Now, one of the things you also need to pay attention to is that stud right there. That's how you know the front of the cam. That's going to be the part that actually has the like the timing gear engages with and whatnot. So we now have the camshaft in here. Now we can see about putting timing gear on it, rear cam plug, and moving forward. So we'll start by putting this guy on. This is a damper for the chain. This is what keeps the chain from kind of getting loose in here. They wear in over time, and you'll start ending up with a lot of slop in it. If it gets really extreme, you could jump teeth, and then you actually have this thing completely out of time. But generally, what happens is over the course of this thing's lifespan, talking 100,000 miles or more, that chain that we're going to put on here in a second will slowly stretch like a few thousandths of an inch. So that's where you get these guys who talk about these old engines where they put it's got 150,000 miles on it. You throw a couple extra degrees of timing in it, and it's fine. And it'll read the wrong time, but it's correct, or it's better, and it runs better. And that's what it is. It's just because there's slop in that chain, and they're not changing it. And if you have that kind of slop in your chain, which this one I remember when I took it apart wasn't that bad. If you have a ton of slop, you are going to want to change that because you've probably worn it in pretty good. But, so this is your new gear. And like I was talking about, that rod is on there. And then this goes on like so. And it's going to have 3 bolts. They're going to tighten them down. And that'll hold your gear in place so that you can have it all on here. Now, one thing you're going to put, before you tighten this down, put the chain on it. Because if you don't have your chain, you're going to have a problem. The other thing you're going to want to keep in mind, and I'll show you, there's a little dot here. You're going to want to rotate your engine around until it's dot to dot, okay? Different engines might have different applications where they want dot top, or dot left, but usually it's going to be dot to dot on these older ones. And that is setting timing for the camshaft to the actual crankshaft so that your valve opening and closing will be timed correctly with your pistons moving. If this is not right, your engine will never be timed correctly. If it runs at all, it'll run very poorly. More than likely, you'll just end up with backfires out your intake and stuff like that, and you'll be taking it apart again to put this back in order. So those are tight, so let me go ahead and grab the chain. I'll rotate this over and I'll show you. And also, everything here should still move smoothly and freely. If you have binding in here at any point where, like, when you're rotating this thing over and, like, you've got a hard spot, you need to start checking stuff because you have something binding up. And when you have an engine and you have these things that rotate, like I said, what these things are air pumps. Is what an engine is an air pump, but it's also a milling machine. If stuff is not, it will clearance itself, and unfortunately when they clearance themselves, it's not good. They tend to break a lot of stuff, and engine performance suffers, and realistically you're in here rebuilding all of it again. So basically, as you assemble, everything should move smoothly. If you start running into issues where stuff is not moving smoothly, you need to get back in there, figure out what's going on, because something's not happy. Okay, so I like to put a little bit of assembly lubricant on the actual gear, and then let me get it lined up correctly. Truthfully, you should probably do this. Yeah, before so you got it in place. But all right, let me move this to where it needs to be, approximately. So that's going to be pretty much directly over. So. Okay, all right, that'll work. Chain on it. Chain orientation is not absolutely critical. It just has to be on here and on the teeth. Come down, put it on the underside. You might take a little bit of back and forth, but you should be able to get that lined up like so. So now our chain is on. We have our new gear. It is an old gear, but it'll be fine. And we have our damper here. So this, once this is all tightened into place, we'll have a nice taut chain and our timing should be set. Because what this is setting top dead center. Or what is called top dead center. And as we're doing more and more assembly, you will probably hear that phrase over and over again. Because it's kind of what we base all engine timing off of, is top dead center cylinder 1, ideally compression stroke. So that is when the piston is going up and down and actively compressing things. That is what we're using for timing. These, there's, I'm sure, like I said, everything any engineer has ever assembled is a torque spec. I have never really torqued these. I just kind of, tighten them down, make sure they're tightened down good and hard. As long as they're not going to move and you're not going to strip out your crank, it's kind of a by feel thing. But again, if you really want to be particular, I don't know that the Haynes or Chilton manuals will actually have a torque spec for this. But if you get a hold of like the actual GM service manual, I promise you it has a specific torque spec for these. Because everything any engineer has ever designed has a torque spec. And don't lose your bolts like me, where you're mismatching them. I mean, we can get away with it, but yeah, try not to do it. I'll rotate this over so it runs that assembly lube all the way around, because I want that chain nice and lubricated for startup. Everything should be good to go. And put dot to dot again around. That's what we want. And now I've got timed again dot to dot. So now our engine is now timed top dead center. Ideally compression stroke cylinder 1. And we'll get more into that later. So we now have the timing set. And our camshaft is now installed. That's pretty much good at that point. Now we can start looking at putting lifters in this engine and putting cylinder heads on. Alright guys, if you made it this far in the video, I appreciate you watching. You're probably realizing that this is a long, time-consuming process to do all this work. It really is. You haven't reached this stage yet, but we'll get there. I started putting this video together and pretty much found that in order to cover it in the detail that I wanted to cover it in, so that anybody going behind me that's maybe building their first engine actually has enough guidance to understand what they're doing and to do it right, I needed to take a little extra time. So this video is coming out very long. The final cut for all of it was about 3 hours. So I split it. So since we're late this month, you're gonna get the this first half right now, and then next month you'll get the next half. But so it's gonna be a two-parter for the engine build, and then after that we'll move on to the car. So in any case, please, if you enjoyed the video, like, comment, subscribe. Just keep an eye out here in a few days for the next half. Thank you for watching.